She left me in a room full of people who suddenly believed I deserved it. Olivia didn't raise her voice when she said it, and that somehow made it worse. We were standing under a chandelier that probably cost more than my entire annual salary at the time, surrounded by men in tailored suits and women who measured worth in net worth and last names. Her hand rested lightly on Victor Hale's arm, like it had always belonged there. No hesitation. No guilt. Just a quiet, confident shift, like she was correcting a mistake she should have fixed years ago. I remember the exact way the room reacted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a subtle change in energy. Conversation slowed. Eyes turned. A few polite smiles disappeared. And just like that, I wasn't her husband anymore. I was the guy she used to be with. "I think we both know this isn't working," she said, her tone calm, almost rehearsed. Like she had practiced this moment in front of a mirror. "You've done your best, Ethan. But your best just isn't enough anymore." She didn't even look at me when she said my name. Her attention stayed on Victor, like she was already aligning herself with the future she had chosen. Victor didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. The watch on his wrist. The way people adjusted their posture when he walked into a room. The way Olivia leaned into him just slightly, like proximity alone could elevate her status. I stood there, holding a glass of something I hadn't even tasted, realizing that everything I thought we built together had just been reduced to a comparison I didn't win. "You're choosing him?" I asked, and even to me, my voice sounded distant, like it didn't belong in that room anymore. Olivia finally looked at me then. Not with anger. Not even with cruelty. Just certainty. "I'm choosing the life I deserve." That was the moment everything became clear. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. All the late nights she dismissed as networking. All the subtle comments about how other men understood ambition differently. All the times she reminded me that potential didn't pay bills. It had all been leading here. I could feel the room. Watching me, waiting for a reaction. Maybe they expected me to argue. To raise my voice. To fight for her in front of an audience that had already decided who mattered more. I didn't give them that. I didn't give her that either. Instead, I set my glass down on the nearest table, carefully enough that it didn't make a sound. "Then I hope it's everything you think it is," I said. No anger. No bitterness. Just a simple sentence that seemed to confuse her more than anything else. For a brief second, something in her expression shifted. Not doubt. Not regret. Just curiosity. Like she expected resistance and didn't know what to do without it. Victor finally spoke, his voice smooth, controlled. "Ethan, I'm sure you understand this is what's best for everyone." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time that night. The man who now stood where I used to stand. The man Olivia believed was her upgrade. And for a moment, I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. But because of what she didn't know. What neither of them knew. I nodded once. "Of course," I said. And that was it. No scene. No breakdown. Just a quiet exit. I walked out of that room alone, past people who suddenly avoided eye contact, past conversations that resumed the second I passed, past a version of my life that no longer existed. The doors closed behind me with a soft click, sealing off the performance she had just perfected. But what she didn't realize, what no one in that room realized, was that this wasn't the moment I lost everything. This was the moment everything finally started to fall into place. Because 3 weeks before she decided I wasn't enough, I had already stepped into a world where her definition of enough didn't even apply anymore. And the man she chose over me wasn't someone I needed to compete with. He was someone I had already decided to work with. I met Olivia when neither of us had anything that impressed people like the ones in that room. No penthouses, no private events, no conversations about investment portfolios over dinner. Just a small apartment with thin walls, a second-hand couch, and two people who believed that working hard would eventually mean something. Back then, she used to look at me like I was enough. Not because of what I had, but because of what we were building together. I was working 60 hours a week, sometimes more, taking on projects nobody else wanted, trying to climb into rooms I was not invited into. She would stay up late waiting for me, talking about the future like it was something we could design if we just stayed patient long enough. And for a while, that belief felt real. But somewhere along the way, patience stopped being admirable to her. It became a weakness. I started noticing the shift in small ways at first. The kind of changes that are easy to ignore when you are busy trying to keep everything together. She began talking about people I had never met before. Men who closed deals faster. Men who did not have to prove themselves the way I did. Men who already lived the life we used to dream about building. At first, it sounded like admiration. Then it turned into comparison. And eventually, it became expectation. She would not say it directly, not in the beginning. It was always framed as encouragement. You should think bigger. You are capable of more than this. Other people are not waiting this long to succeed. But over time, the tone changed. Encouragement turned into frustration. Frustration turned into disappointment. And disappointment turned into something colder. Something more final. The nights we used to spend talking about our future became shorter. Then they stopped happening at all. She started going out more. Events I was never invited to. Dinners that did not include me. Conversations that ended the moment I walked into the room. And every time I asked about it, she had an answer ready. Always reasonable. Always just believable enough to make me question whether I was overthinking it. That was the part that almost worked. Almost. Because the truth does not announce itself all at once. It shows up in patterns. In small inconsistencies that do not make sense until they all start pointing in the same direction. The late night calls that she took in another room. The way she smiled at her phone but never explained why. The subtle ways she started correcting me. In public, like she needed to remind people that we were not equals anymore. And then there was Victor. The first time she mentioned him, it was casual. Just another name in a long list of people she had met through connections. A successful investor. Someone who understood how to move in the kind of circles she was trying to enter. I did not think much of it at the time. I should have. Because after that, his name came up more often. Then it stopped coming up altogether. Which somehow said even more. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already behind. Not because I was unaware. But because I had been focused on something else entirely. Something she never asked about. Something she never cared to understand. 3 weeks before that night under the chandelier, I had walked into an office that did not look anything like the places I was used to. Floor-to-ceiling glass. Clean lines. Quiet confidence in every detail. Victor was already there when I arrived. Not the version of him that stood beside my wife that night, smiling like he had already won. A different version. Focused. Measured. Looking at me like I was not just another face trying to prove something. You are not here by accident, he said after we shook hands. It was not a question. It was an assessment. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. He already knew enough. Enough to understand what I brought to the table. Enough to see something Olivia never bothered to look for. What she saw as limitation, he saw as discipline. What she called slow, he recognized as control. That meeting did not change my life in a dramatic way. There was no sudden transformation. No instant success story. Just a quiet agreement. A partnership built on something real. Something structured. Something that did not need an audience to exist. And that was the difference. Olivia had been chasing visibility, status, the appearance of success. Victor was building something that did not need to announce itself to be powerful. And somewhere between those two worlds, I had already made my choice. She just did not realize it yet. The strange thing about betrayal is that it does not feel like a single moment when it happens. It feels like something that has been quietly unfolding long before you are willing to admit it. After that meeting with Victor, I started seeing everything differently, not because my life had changed overnight, but because I finally understood what I was looking at. Olivia did not suddenly become someone else. She became more of who she already was. The difference was that I stopped filtering it through loyalty. I started noticing how she spoke about people when they were not in the room. Not just strangers, but friends, colleagues, even people who had helped her. There was always a calculation behind her words, like she was constantly measuring who was worth keeping and who was not. And slowly, I realized I was being measured too. It showed up in conversations that seemed harmless on the surface. She would ask questions about my work, but not because she was interested. Because she was evaluating. "Do you see yourself still doing this in 5 years?" she asked one night while scrolling through her phone, barely looking at me. I told her I was building towards something bigger. That I was working on opportunities that were not visible yet. She nodded, but it was the kind of nod people give when they have already decided you are wrong. "You have been building for a long time," she said. "At some point, results have to show." I did not argue. I did not explain. Because what she called slow, I understood as deliberate. What she saw as lack, I knew was structure. But I also understood something else in that moment. She was no longer invested in the process. She only cared about the outcome. And more importantly, she wanted that outcome now. The gap between us was not financial. It was philosophical. I was focused on control, sustainability, and long-term positioning. She was focused on visibility, status, and immediate validation. And once those two priorities stopped aligning, everything else followed. She began attending more events that I was not invited to. Not because I could not go, but because she did not want me there. That distinction matters more than most people realize. It is one thing to be excluded because you do not belong. It is another thing to be excluded because someone decides you no longer fit their narrative. I remember one evening when she came home later than usual. Not late enough to raise suspicion on its own, but late enough to carry a different kind of energy. She was quieter, but not in a guilty way. In a satisfied way. Like someone who had just confirmed something they needed to believe. "You would not have enjoyed it," she said when I asked where she had been. "It was not really your kind of environment." That was the first time she said something like that out loud. Not directly insulting, but clear enough to understand. Not your kind of environment. As if we now existed in different categories. As if the life we once shared had already been divided into before and after. That was when I stopped asking questions. Not because I did not want answers, but because I already had them. Every decision she made after that became easier to predict. Every shift in her behavior became more obvious. And at the same time, I became quieter. Not withdrawn. Not defeated. Just more precise with where I placed my attention. Because while she was moving further into a world that valued appearances, I was stepping deeper into one that valued leverage. And those two paths do not just separate. They eventually collide. The difference is, one of them depends on perception to survive. The other does not. The final break did not come with a fight. It came with efficiency. Papers filed faster than I expected, conversations reduced to short, transactional exchanges, and a level of emotional detachment that made it clear she had already moved on long before anything became official. Olivia did not drag things out. She did not hesitate. She treated the end of our marriage the same way she approached everything else by that point, as a decision that needed to be executed cleanly and without unnecessary complication. And that was what made it undeniable. People do not move that fast unless they have already made peace with the outcome. I remember sitting across from her in a quiet office, a stack of documents between us, realizing that the person I once knew would have never been this calm about something that used to matter so much. She signed her name without pausing. No second thoughts. No lingering questions. Just a smooth, practiced motion, like she had signed more important agreements before this one. "This is better for both of us," she said, not looking at me, just aligning the papers into a neat stack as if organization alone could justify the decision. I nodded once. Not because I agreed, but because I understood something she did not. This was not the moment she gained control. It was the moment she gave it up. The strange part was how quickly everything else followed. Within days, her schedule changed completely. New routines. New priorities. New people. She was no longer trying to balance two worlds. She had already chosen one. And from the outside, it probably looked like she made the right move. Victor's name started appearing more frequently in places where it mattered. Business publications. Event guest lists. Conversations that carried weight. The kind of visibility Olivia had always been drawn to. And just as quickly, she became part of that narrative. Introduced in conversations not as someone building something, but as someone connected to someone who already had. That distinction mattered more than she realized. Because while she was stepping into a role defined by association, I was moving into one defined by position. The difference between those two is not obvious at first. But over time, it becomes everything. I stayed quiet through all of it. Not distant. Not reactive. Just focused. I continued my meetings. I continued building what Victor and I had agreed on. Structures, deals, systems that did not rely on attention to function. The kind of work that does not look impressive in the moment, but defines everything later. There were times when people asked about the divorce. Colleagues, acquaintances, even a few friends who did not know what to say but felt obligated to say something. I gave them the same answer every time. It was necessary. Nothing more. Because explaining it would have required me to describe a version of her that no longer existed. And more importantly, it would have revealed parts of my own situation that were not meant to be understood yet. What she did not know, what she never asked to understand, was how closely our paths were still connected. Not emotionally. Not personally. But structurally. Decisions she thought were separate were already intersecting with things I was building. Opportunities she believed she had gained were already tied to agreements she had never seen. That was the part people always miss when they think power is about money or visibility. Real power is about position. About where you sit when decisions are made. About what you control when no one is watching. And while Olivia was adjusting to a new life that looked exactly like what she had wanted, I was stepping into a role that did not need to be seen to be effective. Because by the time she believed she had upgraded her life, she had already placed herself inside a system where I had more influence than she could possibly understand. And the moment that became visible was not going to be subtle. It was not going to be private. It was going to happen in the same kind of room where she thought she had left me behind. The lowest point was not the night she left or the moment the papers were signed. It was the silence that followed. Not the kind that feels peaceful, but the kind that forces you to sit with everything you have been avoiding. The apartment felt different without her, not because of what was missing, but because of what was no longer pretending to be there. Half the closet was empty. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been in years. Even the air felt still, like the space itself had stopped trying to hold something together that was already gone. I would come home after long days and stand there for a few seconds longer than necessary, just taking in the quiet. Not broken. Not angry. Just aware. Aware that the life I thought I had built was never as stable as I believed. Aware that I had been holding on to an idea of us that she had already let go of. And that awareness did something unexpected. It did not weaken me. It sharpened me. I stopped reacting to what had happened and started focusing on what was actually in front of me. Work became simpler. Not easier, but clearer. Every meeting with Victor carried weight now. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I understood exactly where I stood. We were not building something temporary. We were building something that would outlast the kind of surface-level success Olivia had been chasing. Systems, partnerships, control points that were invisible to most people but defined everything underneath. Victor did not waste time on unnecessary conversations. He did not care about appearances. He cared about execution. That was something I respected immediately. Most people think leverage is about money, he said during one meeting, sliding a set of documents across the table. It is not. It is about access. About who gets to make the decision when it matters. I did not respond right away. I just looked at the numbers, the structures, the way everything connected. Because I already understood what he was saying. And more importantly, I understood where I fit into it. The days started to take on a different rhythm. Early mornings. Long hours. Conversations that required focus instead of performance. There was no audience here. No need to impress. Just results that would eventually speak for themselves. And somewhere in the middle of that routine, the past started to feel smaller. Not irrelevant, but contained. Like something that had already served its purpose. Occasionally, I would hear things about Olivia. Not directly from her, but through the kind of channels that always carry information whether you want them to or not. She was adapting quickly. Attending the right events. Meeting the right people. Being seen in the right places. From the outside, it looked exactly like the life she had been working toward. The kind of life she once told me I could not give her. And maybe she was right about that part. Because what I was building was not designed to be visible. It was designed to be effective. That difference was going to matter more than she realized. The first real indication came through a scheduling request. Not from her. From Victor's office. A formal event. A room filled with investors, executives, and people who influenced decisions at a level most never reached. It was positioned as a presentation. A reveal of something new. Something significant. And as I read through the details, I noticed something that made me pause for just a second. Her name was on the guest list. Not as a speaker. Not as a decision maker. Just as an attendee. Someone who would be present, but not positioned. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, letting the moment settle. Because this was not coincidence. This was alignment. The kind that only happens when multiple paths converge at the same point. She thought she had stepped into a better world. A higher level. A more powerful position. What she did not realize was that she had stepped into a room where the rules were different. Where perception did not define outcomes. Where association did not equal control. And where the person she believed she had left behind was no longer standing outside trying to get in. I was already inside. And when that door closed behind everyone else, the difference between being invited and being in control was going to become impossible to ignore. The event was scheduled for a Thursday evening, the kind of night where the city looked polished and intentional, like everything had been arranged to impress someone important. The venue sat on the top floor of a glass building downtown, overlooking blocks of lights and moving traffic that made everything below look smaller than it really was. I arrived early, not because I needed to, but because I prefer seeing a room before it fills. It tells you everything you need to know. The layout was precise. Tables spaced just far enough apart to allow private conversations, but close enough to maintain a sense of exclusivity. A stage at the front with a single podium, understated but positioned in a way that controlled the entire room. This was not just an event. It was a statement. Victor understood presentation, but more importantly, he understood timing. I moved through the space quietly, exchanging brief acknowledgements with people who knew my name but not yet my role. That was intentional. Position first, recognition later. That was always the order that mattered. As the room began to fill, the energy shifted. Conversations layered on top of each other, deals hinted at in half sentences, relationships reinforced through subtle gestures. This was the environment Olivia had been trying to enter. And tonight, she was here. I noticed her before she noticed me. She walked in beside Victor, her posture controlled, her expression composed, like she had practiced being in this space until it felt natural. She looked comfortable. Confident. Like she belonged. And from the outside, she did. That was the part most people would get wrong. Belonging is easy to imitate when you understand the surface. What she did not understand was what happened underneath it. She greeted people with the kind of ease that comes from being introduced rather than established. Smiling, engaging, aligning herself with conversations that carried weight without having to direct them. Victor stayed close, not possessive, just present. His role was clear. He was the access point. She was the extension. I stayed where I was, watching the patterns form. Who approached who? Who waited to be acknowledged? Who controlled the flow of conversation without raising their voice? These things matter more than titles. More than introductions. They tell you where the real power sits. At one point, she laughed at something someone said, her hand briefly resting on Victor's arm the same way it had that night weeks ago. The gesture was identical. Familiar. Intentional. And for a moment, I saw the entire sequence play out again, just in a different room, with a different audience. Except this time, the structure was not what she thought it was. The event moved forward exactly as planned. Drinks were served. Conversation settled. Attention gradually shifted toward the front of the room. The kind of shift that does not need to be announced. People just know when it is time. Victor stepped away from the cluster around him and made his way toward the stage. Olivia followed a step behind, stopping just short as he continued forward. That detail mattered. She was close enough to be seen, but not positioned to lead. Not positioned to control. The room quieted as he reached the podium. No microphone feedback. No unnecessary introduction. Just presence. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice steady, carrying without effort. He spoke about growth, about expansion, about opportunity. The kind of language that sounds broad but is always anchored in something specific. Something that only a few people in the room fully understand. And then he shifted. Not in tone, but in direction. Tonight is not just about what we have built, he said. It is about who is going to help take it further. That was the moment the room leaned in. Not physically, but mentally. Attention sharpened. Conversation stopped completely. This was the part that mattered. Olivia turned slightly toward him, her expression focused, like she was about to hear something that confirmed everything she believed about her position. And that was when everything aligned. Victor glanced out over the room, not scanning, not searching, just confirming. Then he said something that most people would interpret as a simple introduction. Some of you have already met him, he continued. Most of you have not. But he has been behind more of this than you realize. There was a pause. Not for effect. Just long enough for the words to settle. And in that space, before my name was even spoken, I could feel the shift beginning. Because what she did not know, what she had never asked, what she had never considered, was about to become impossible to ignore. Victor did not rush the moment. He never did. He let the silence stretch just long enough for curiosity to turn into focus, for attention to narrow into a single point. That was something I had learned about him early on. Timing is not about speed. It is about control. Ethan Cole, he said finally, his voice steady, almost casual, like the name itself did not carry the weight it actually did. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Not because people did not hear it, but because they were processing it. Names in rooms like this matter, but context matters more. And most of them did not have the context yet. I stepped forward without hesitation. Not fast. Not slow. Just deliberate. Each step measured, each movement controlled. The kind of movement that does not ask for attention, but naturally receives it. I could feel the shift before I even reached the front. Conversations that had ended were not restarting. Eyes that had been relaxed were now focused. Recognition was beginning to connect with memory. A few people in the room had met me before, in smaller meetings, in quieter settings where introductions were minimal and roles were not fully explained. Now those fragments were starting to align into something clearer. I reached the stage and shook Victor's hand, a simple gesture, but one that carried more meaning than anything he had said so far. Not as an assistant. Not as an employee. As an equal. That distinction was not announced. It was understood. Ethan has been instrumental in structuring what we are presenting tonight, Victor continued, stepping slightly to the side, giving me space without making it obvious. In fact, most of what you are about to see would not exist without his involvement. The words were direct, but they were not exaggerated. That was another thing about Victor. He did not overstate. He positioned. And positioning in a room like this does more than any explanation ever could. I turned slightly, facing the audience, letting my gaze move across the room without stopping too long on anyone. Until I reached her. Olivia was still standing near the front, close enough to see everything clearly, but far enough that she was not part of it. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would draw attention from anyone else. But I knew her well enough to see it. The confidence she walked in with had not disappeared. It had been interrupted. Replaced by something else. Something quieter. Something more uncertain. She was trying to process what she was seeing, trying to fit it into the version of reality she had already accepted. And it was not fitting. That was the moment the difference became visible. Not between me and Victor. But between perception and position. She thought she had moved into a higher level. A better world. A more powerful space. What she was seeing now was that the structure of that world did not match the assumptions she built it on. Victor handed me the floor. Without making a formal announcement. Another subtle detail that most people would miss. He did not introduce me as someone stepping in. He transitioned as if I had already been part of this. Because I had. I spoke briefly. Not to impress. Not to explain everything. Just enough to establish presence. Enough to confirm what Victor had already positioned. The language was simple. Focused. Clear. No unnecessary details. No overpromising. Just structure. Just direction. And that was all it took. Because in rooms like this, people do not need to hear everything. They just need to understand who is in control. When I finished, there was a moment of quiet before the room responded. Not with applause, but with something more valuable. Engagement. People leaning in. Conversations restarting, but with a different tone. A different focus. And in that shift, everything became clear. Not just to them. But to her. Because what she did not realize when she walked into that room, what she could not have known when she made her decision weeks ago, was that she had not stepped into a better position. She had stepped into a system where the person she thought she had left behind was no longer on the outside looking in. I was part of the structure. And in that structure, her position was not what she believed it to be. The shift in the room did not stop when I finished speaking. It deepened. Conversations that had already restarted began to orbit in a different direction, gravitating toward me instead of around Victor alone. That was the part Olivia was not prepared for. It was one thing to hear my name. It was another to watch what happened after. People who had been standing beside her just minutes earlier were now repositioning themselves, subtly, almost politely, but with clear intention. Attention is a currency in rooms like this, and it had already started to move. I stepped down from the stage without looking back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I did not need to confirm what I already knew. The structure had revealed itself. The rest would follow naturally. Victor joined me a moment later, his expression unchanged, like everything had gone exactly as expected. "You handled that well," he said quietly, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. I nodded once. There was no need for more. We both understood what had just happened. What mattered now was what came next. And that was when I saw her moving toward me. Not quickly. Not impulsively. But with a kind of controlled urgency that only someone trying to maintain composure would use. Olivia stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to keep the interaction from becoming a scene. For a brief moment, she said nothing. She just looked at me, studying my face like she was trying to find something familiar that would explain everything she had just witnessed. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice lower than usual, more measured. "I did not know you were involved in this." I held her gaze, not confrontational, not distant, just steady. "There are a lot of things you did not ask about," I replied. The words were simple. No accusation. No emotion attached to them. Just a fact. She absorbed that, her expression tightening slightly, not out of anger, but out of realization. "You never mentioned anything like this," she continued, as if the absence of information somehow justified her assumptions. I let a small pause sit between us. "You were not interested in anything that was not visible yet," I said. That landed differently. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, just slightly, like something inside her had been recalibrated. She glanced toward Victor for a second, then back at me, trying to reconcile the connection she thought she understood with the one that was now undeniable. "So what is this?" she asked, her tone controlled, but no longer confident. "What exactly is your role here?" That question mattered more than she realized. Not because of the answer, but because of what it meant for her to ask it. It meant she no longer believed she already knew. I did not answer immediately. Not because I was avoiding it, but because timing still mattered. Around us, the room continued moving, but slower now, more focused, like people were aware that something important was unfolding just beneath the surface. I helped decide. "Where things go," I said finally. Not a title. Not a label. Just the truth in its simplest form. Her eyes held on mine for a second longer than necessary. Processing. Adjusting. Realizing. Because in that moment, everything she had built her decision on started to shift. The assumption that she had moved up. The belief that she had secured a better position. The confidence that she understood the hierarchy she had stepped into. All of it was now incomplete. "I thought," she started, then stopped herself. That was the first time I had seen her hesitate in a long time. Not because she lacked words, but because she was no longer sure which version of reality those words belonged to. I did not finish that sentence for her. I did not need to. Because what she thought no longer mattered. What mattered was what she could now see. The room. The positioning. The way people approached me differently than they approached her. Not rudely. Not dismissively. Just with a clarity that did not need explanation. She had entered this world believing she understood how it worked. Tonight was showing her that she had only understood the surface. And the deeper she looked, the more that surface started to fall apart. I stepped slightly to the side as someone approached to speak with me, a quiet signal that our conversation was over, not abruptly, but definitively. Take care, Olivia, I said, the same way I would have said it to anyone else in the room. No emphasis. No weight. Just closure. And as I turned my attention back to the people who were now part of my present, I did not need to look back to know that the realization had fully set in. Not all at once. But enough. Enough for her to understand that she had not just misjudged me. She had misjudged the entire structure she chose to step into. And by the time she fully understood it, there was nothing left for her to adjust. By the time the event began to wind down, the room had already decided where its attention belonged. Conversations no longer circled around possibilities. They moved with direction. With intent. And more importantly, with clarity about who was shaping what came next. I stayed for what was necessary. Nothing more. That was something I had learned over time. Presence is important, but overstaying dilutes it. I spoke with the people I needed to speak with, confirmed the decisions that required confirmation, and let everything else move without me. Victor understood that without explanation. We exchanged a brief nod across the room at one point, not as a signal, but as acknowledgement. The structure held. That was all that mattered. I did not see Olivia again before I left. Not because she was not there, but because there was no reason to look. Whatever needed to be understood had already been made clear. Not through confrontation. Not through explanation. Through positioning. Through reality revealing itself without needing to be explained. Outside, the night air felt different. Cooler. Quieter. The kind of contrast that only exists after being inside a room where everything carries weight. I stood there for a moment, not reflecting, not replaying anything, just present. Because the truth was, there was nothing left to process. No anger. No satisfaction. Just completion. People assume moments like that are about winning. About proving something. They are not. They are about alignment. About finally standing in a place where what you have built matches what you understand. Olivia had spent months, maybe longer, moving toward a version of success that looked right from the outside. And in doing so, she had made a decision based on visibility, on perception, on what she believed would elevate her position. What she did not account for was structure. For what exists beneath the surface. For the difference between being near power and actually holding it. I did not take anything from her. I did not need to. She made her choice with the information she valued. And that information was incomplete. That is not something you can correct after the fact. Over the next few weeks, I heard less about her. Not because she disappeared, but because she no longer occupied the same level of conversation. That is how it works in environments like that. Relevance is tied to position, not proximity. And once that distinction becomes clear, everything adjusts accordingly. I focused on what was in front of me. The work expanded. The responsibilities grew. Decisions carried more weight, but also more clarity. There was no confusion about where I stood or what I controlled. And that kind of certainty removes the need for anything else. One afternoon, weeks later, I received a message from a number I recognized but had not expected to see again. It was brief. No explanation. No context. Just a single line asking if we could talk. I looked at it for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was considering it, but because I understood what it represented. Not regret in the way people usually describe it. Something more subtle. A recognition that the assumptions she had relied on no longer held. That the version of reality she acted on had shifted. I did not respond. Not out of resentment. Not out of indifference. But because there was nothing left to say that had not already been shown. Some conversations happen in words. Others happen in outcomes. And this one had already reached its conclusion. I set my phone down and returned to the work in front of me. Because that was always the difference. She had been focused on choosing the right person. I had been focused on becoming the right position. And once those two paths separated, there was never a point where they were going to meet again. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.